You're going to fail again this week. Maybe it'll be small. A missed deadline, an awkward conversation, a project that fizzles out. Maybe it'll be catastrophic. A lost opportunity, a public humiliation, a collapse of something you built for months. And here's what you'll do. You'll feel that sick twist in your stomach. You'll replay it obsessively. You'll either beat yourself up or make excuses. Then you'll distract yourself and hope the feeling goes away. But what if I told you that a man who was born into slavery, who had nothing, who was beaten and broken, developed a philosophy that turns failure into the most valuable resource you'll ever possess? His name was Epictetus, and his system for extracting power from failure is so ruthlessly effective, so psychologically precise, that 2,000 years later, it's still the secret weapon of everyone from military commanders to championship athletes to billionaire entrepreneurs. This video will show you exactly how to weaponize his teachings against the paralysis that's keeping you stuck. Before we go further, let me confirm something. You clicked on this video because you're tired of the sugar-coated self-help garbage that tells you to embrace failure without giving you a single practical tool for actually doing it. You're intelligent, you're ambitious, but you're also stuck. Maybe you're paralyzed by comparison, watching others succeed while you're still preparing. Maybe you're crushed by perfectionism, killing projects before they have a chance to breathe. Maybe you start strong but bail the moment things get hard. Here's what this video is not. Generic Stoic wisdom you've heard 1,000 times. Motivational fluff about believing in yourself. Business tactics or relationship manipulation. Here's what this is. A 20-minute deep dive into the darkest, most practical teachings of a man who had every reason to give up, but instead built a philosophical system that turns suffering into strategic advantage. I'm going to show you why your intelligence is actually the source of your paralysis, the exact autopsy protocol Epictetus would use on your failures, how to detach from outcomes without becoming passive, the dark truth about why you keep repeating the same failures, and the 5 ruthless tactics that will rewire how your brain processes setbacks. If you're ready to stop running from your wreckage and start profiting from it, keep watching. But first, let me tell you something about Epictetus that nobody mentions in those inspirational quote posts. He wasn't some privileged philosopher sitting in an ivory tower theorizing about hardship. He was born a slave in the Roman Empire around 50 AD. His name literally means acquired, property, not a person. He was owned by Epictetus, a wealthy freedman who served as secretary to Emperor Nero. And at some point during his slavery, something happened that left him permanently disabled. Some historians say his master deliberately broke his leg as punishment. Here's the part that should terrify you. This man, who had less freedom than almost anyone alive, who suffered physical torture, who had zero control over his circumstances, developed a philosophy that made him psychologically invincible. While you're paralyzed because you have too many options, he thrived with none. While you're defeated by setbacks you could recover from in weeks, he extracted power from brutality that would break most people permanently. The gap between you and him isn't circumstances, it's philosophy. And the philosophy he developed, preserved in his discourses and the Enchiridion, a handbook of his core teachings, contains the exact blueprint for turning your failures into fuel. But here's the uncomfortable question we need to answer first. Why does having more opportunity make you less effective? The intelligence trap. Let's start with the dark truth you need to hear. Your intelligence is why you're paralyzed. I know that sounds backwards. You've been told your whole life that intelligence is an advantage. And it is, except when it comes to taking action after failure. Here's what happens in your brain that didn't happen in Epictetus's. You see too many paths. After a failure, your mind immediately generates dozens of alternative scenarios. What if I had done X? What if I try Y next time? What about Z? This isn't analysis. It's paralysis disguised as thinking.
You calculate too many outcomes. You've gamed out every possible future scenario, including all the ways you could fail again. So you freeze, waiting for the right moment that never comes. You turn failure into an existential event. Because you're smart, you don't just think, that didn't work. You think, that didn't work, which means I'm not as capable as I thought, which means my entire self-concept is flawed, which means... Epictetus didn't have this problem. Not because he was less intelligent, but because he developed a framework that bypassed the intelligence trap entirely.
And this framework is built on one of the most counterintuitive insights in all of philosophy. Something that will sound completely wrong when you first hear it, but will change everything once you understand it. Stay with me, because this is where it gets dark. In the Enchiridion, Epictetus opens with this: some things are within our control, and some things are not. Sounds obvious, right? Every self-help guru quotes this. But they're missing the weapon hidden inside it. Here's what Epictetus actually meant. The outcome is never in your control, only your effort and response. But here's the part that most people can't accept. This means you need to emotionally detach from results while staying obsessed with execution. Most people do the opposite. They're attached to winning and indifferent about their daily process. They care desperately about whether they succeed, but they're sloppy with their preparation, inconsistent with their effort, and reactive in their response to setbacks. Epictetus would call this insanity. Here's what weaponizing the dichotomy of control actually looks like. Before you start anything, visualize the worst-case failure scenario in graphic detail. Not to scare yourself, but to strip it of its power. Ask yourself, if this fails completely, what will I have learned that I don't know now? There's always an answer. Maybe you learn you're not as prepared as you thought. Maybe you learn the market doesn't care about your idea. Maybe you learn you're terrible at managing your energy under pressure. That's valuable intelligence. Then declare, I'm running this experiment to collect data, not to prove I'm valuable. This single sentence removes the ego from the equation. You're not trying to prove you're smart or talented or worthy. You're just testing a hypothesis. Then execute with everything you have. Not because you're attached to the outcome, but because effort is the only thing you control. Half-hearted execution teaches you nothing. Now, I can already hear the objection forming in your mind. This sounds like I'm just giving myself permission to fail. That's exactly wrong. And understanding why it's wrong is the key to everything that follows. Here's where Epictetus's philosophy gets ruthlessly practical. He didn't just teach detachment from outcomes. He taught a systematic process for extracting maximum value from every setback. In his discourses, he writes about the importance of examining your judgments, the stories you tell yourself about what happened. Most people don't examine failures. They either avoid thinking about them, distraction, obsess over them emotionally, rumination, or construct elaborate narratives that protect their ego, rationalization. None of these extract value. Here's the protocol Epictetus would use. Within 48 hours of any significant failure, you sit down and conduct a forensic autopsy. Not a feelings journal, an investigation. Question 1. What was the exact moment things went wrong? Not vague feelings, the precise decision, conversation, or action where the trajectory shifted. Most people can't answer this because they weren't paying attention. They were operating on autopilot. Question 2. What false assumption was I operating under? Every failure traces back to a belief that turned out to be wrong. Maybe you assumed people would care about your idea without you having to sell it. Maybe you assumed your motivation would last without a system. Maybe you assumed you could wing it without preparation. The false assumption is the gold, because once you see it, you can't unsee it.
Question 3. What did I avoid looking at because it was uncomfortable? This is the killer question. Epictetus was obsessed with this. The human tendency to ignore what we don't want to see. You knew the project was in trouble 3 weeks before it collapsed, but you didn't want to admit it. You knew you were unprepared for that presentation, but you hoped it would work out. You knew that person was unreliable, but you wanted to believe otherwise. The warning sign you ignored is your edge, because next time, you'll see it coming. Question 4. What would someone who succeeded at this have done differently? Not aspirational fantasy, specific, tactical differences. They would have started 2 months earlier. They would have tested their idea with real users instead of just thinking about it. They would have asked for help instead of trying to figure it out alone. Question 5. What can I test in the next 72 hours based on this data? This is where most people fail the autopsy. They analyze, they understand, they feel enlightened, and then they do nothing. Epictetus would say, insight without application is worthless. You need to immediately test one thing differently. Not next month, not when you're ready. In 72 hours. Now here's the dark part that nobody wants to acknowledge. Most of your failures trace back to the same 2 to 3 patterns you keep refusing to see. The autopsy will reveal them. You won't like what you see. But let me tell you something about Epictetus that should give you hope. After Epictetus was freed from slavery, sometime in his 30s, he studied under the Stoic philosopher Musonius Rufus and eventually started his own school in Nicopolis. And here's what made him different from other philosophers. He wasn't teaching abstract theory. He was teaching pattern recognition. His students would come to him with their problems, and he'd show them how they were repeating the same mental errors over and over. The same false judgments, the same emotional reactions, the same avoidance behaviors. He understood something that modern psychology is just confirming. You don't have 100 different problems. You have 2 to 3 core patterns that manifest in different situations. Here's the exercise that will change everything. Create a document. Title it The Failure Inventory. List every significant failure from the past 5 years, not categories, specific events. The job you didn't get, the project you abandoned, the habit you couldn't sustain, the relationship you sabotaged, the opportunity you talked yourself out of. Now look for the pattern. I guarantee you'll find one of these. Pattern 1, the escape artist. You quit when things get difficult, not when they're actually wrong. The moment you hit resistance, you reframe it as, this isn't for me, instead of, this is where it gets interesting. Pattern 2, the perfectionist executioner. You kill projects that aren't perfect enough before they have a chance to succeed. You mistake early clumsiness for fundamental inadequacy. Pattern 3, the comparison casualty. You abandon things because someone else is further ahead. You turn their head start into evidence that you're behind, when you're actually just on a different timeline. Pattern 4, the shiny object syndrome. You chase new ideas before exhausting old ones. You mistake novelty for progress, variety for growth. Which one is yours? Be honest, because here's what Epictetus understood. Once you see your pattern, you can't unsee it. And you'll notice it's about to happen again in real time. That's when you have a choice. Repeat it unconsciously or interrupt it consciously. But seeing the pattern isn't enough. Because your brain has spent years reinforcing this pattern. It's automated. It's comfortable. So how do you actually interrupt it? This is where Epictetus's most powerful technique comes in. Something he called premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils. And it's way darker than it sounds.
Here's what Epictetus taught his students. You're not afraid of failure. You're afraid of the feeling of failure. The anticipation of that sick twist in your stomach, that wave of embarrassment, that collapse of your self-image. That's what paralyzes you. So his solution was radical. Deliberately expose yourself to the feeling in controlled doses. This is premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils. Before you start any project or commitment, you sit down and visualize the worst-case scenario in graphic, specific detail. Not to catastrophize, not to talk yourself out of it, to remove the feeling's power over you. Here's how you do it. Close your eyes. Imagine you've just failed spectacularly at this thing you're about to attempt. Really feel it. Feel the embarrassment. Feel the disappointment. Feel people's judgment. Now ask, what specifically am I afraid will happen to me as a result of this failure? Will I die? No. Will I lose people I love? Probably not. Will I lose my livelihood? Unlikely. Will I feel bad for a few days or weeks? Yes. And there it is, the thing you're actually afraid of. Temporary discomfort. Epictetus would say, you're trading permanent progress for the avoidance of temporary discomfort. But here's the weapon hidden in this practice. Once you've visualized the worst-case scenario and realized it's survivable, you've stripped failure of its power. You've already experienced it mentally. The actual event becomes less terrifying. Now take it further. Create a failure fund, a list of 3 to 5 small, low-stakes experiments you're deliberately running to fail. Not, I hope this works, but I'm prepared to fail. Actual experiments where you're trying to find the breaking point. Examples. Cold email 20 people in your industry asking for advice to learn how rejection feels at scale. Start a public project you're underqualified for to face imposter syndrome head-on. Set an absurdly ambitious 7-day challenge to see how you react under self-imposed pressure. The point? You're desensitizing yourself to the sting of failure through controlled exposure. Most of your paralysis comes from inexperience with failure, not fear of it. You've avoided it so much that it's become this massive, undefined monster. Expose yourself deliberately, and it becomes just data. Now, I know what you're thinking. This sounds exhausting. Do I really have to analyze every failure and deliberately expose myself to discomfort? And the answer is, only if you want to be free. Because here's what most people don't understand about Epictetus. Epictetus spent the first 30 years of his life in literal bondage. He had no freedom whatsoever. But by the time he was freed, he was already psychologically free. How? Because he'd spent years developing a practice that gave him control over the only thing that actually matters: his response to circumstances. He writes in the Enchiridion, "It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters." But here's what people miss. This isn't passive acceptance. This is active, ruthless control over your internal state. The freedom Epictetus achieved wasn't about having no problems. It was about having a systematic way to profit from every problem. And that system has 5 ruthless components. Component 1, the Autopsy Protocol. Forensic analysis of every failure within 48 hours. No emotional processing, just data extraction. Component 2, the Pattern Inventory. Documenting your repeated failures to identify your core 2 to 3 patterns. No self-deception, just pattern recognition. Component 3, the Desensitization Protocol. Deliberately exposing yourself to failure in controlled doses. No avoidance, just building immunity. Component 4, the Dichotomy of Control.
Detaching from outcomes while obsessing over effort. No attachment to results, just commitment to process. Component 5. The iteration identity. Reframing yourself as someone who iterates relentlessly, not someone who fails occasionally. No shame, just velocity. These 5 components form a closed loop. You attempt something, it fails. You autopsy it. You identify your pattern. You expose yourself to the fear. You detach from the outcome. You iterate immediately. You attempt again. And each cycle makes you more psychologically bulletproof.
So let me paint you a picture of what happens when you actually implement this system. 6 months from now, you'll still fail, but you won't spiral. You'll sit down, conduct your autopsy, extract the lesson, and iterate within 72 hours. You'll still feel the sting of setbacks, but you won't be paralyzed by them. You'll recognize them as data, not verdicts. You'll still have fear, but you'll have exposed yourself to it so many times that it's lost its grip. You'll act despite it, not because of some burst of courage, but because you've systematized forward motion. The gap between you and the people who seem naturally resilient isn't talent. It's that they've iterated so many times that failure has become invisible in the noise of their output. They launch, they learn, they adjust, they launch again. The gap between attempts is measured in days, not months. That can be you, but only if you're willing to do what Epictetus did. Stop running from the wreckage. Sit down with it. Study it. Extract everything valuable from it. Then use it as fuel for the next attempt. Now here's the challenge you're going to face. You'll watch this video, feel energized, maybe even take some notes. And then life will happen. You'll get busy, the urgency will fade, and you'll slip back into old patterns. That's the real enemy. Not failure itself, but the gap between knowing and doing. So here's what I want you to do in the next 24 hours. Pick one failure from the past 6 months that still bothers you. Conduct the autopsy. Answer all 5 questions with brutal honesty. Identify your pattern. Then test one thing differently in the next 72 hours. Not next week, not when you're ready. In 72 hours. If you want more frameworks like this, dark philosophy weaponized against paralysis, procrastination, and mental warfare, hit subscribe. Because this channel isn't about feeling good. It's about becoming psychologically invincible through ruthless self-examination and systematic action. The next video will show you how to use Machiavellian tactics to break the comparison trap that's keeping you from starting. You won't want to miss it. But remember, every day you delay the autopsy, you're just guaranteeing the same failure happens again. Now stop watching and go examine your wreckage. You already know which failure needs the autopsy.